Well, good afternoon. Sorry. Good afternoon. Pleasure to have you here, and pleasure to have you share with us this time and space of celebrating 10 years of the Center for Civil Society and Democracy, and Civil Society, and also the 7 years that we've had our program of the MA in Democracy and Governance in place. So we thought that it would be an appropriate occasion to bring together a number of guests and also distinguished members of the audience to talk about democracy, the state of democracy 25 years on. You all probably know, if not personally, certainly by virtue of their writings, those who are going to be presenting, as well as the panelist, the commentator, our own Dan Bernberg. So what I'd like to do is get out of the way as quickly as possible and simply make some very general introductions about our distinguished guests. I'm going to go in reverse order because our first speaker will be Tom Carruthers, but I'll introduce him shortly. We have with us Sharon Wolczyk, who I'm very happy to see because we used to see each other a lot. I dare not say how many decades ago, when talking about Eurocommunism and changes in the Soviet world, or circa Soviet world in the 1980s. Sharon, as you know, received her PhD at the University of Michigan, has taught at GW for a long time, has a long list of publications and research interests, gender, ethnic nationalities, and most recently the book that she wrote with Valerie Bunce on sort of how to deal with autocrats in post-communist societies. And she will focus on the sort of the state of democracy in Eastern Europe, or I should say Central Europe and beyond, with specific perhaps a reference, I think, to the Ukraine. Okay. So Sharon will be last. Next on the list is Steve Heidemann, who again is probably well known to most of you, both because of the positions that he has held both here at Georgetown and also at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and particularly for his work on the Middle East, and more specifically yet on Syria. And he's going to be talking on democracy 25 years on, and where is it going, and where might it not be going in that region. And then finally, our initial presenter this afternoon is again someone that needs no introduction, Tom Carruthers, who's at the Carnegie Institute. You know him because he's Vice President for Studies there. He's written 5 or 6 books on the question of democracy and democracy assistance, and he's going to help us by trying to frame the issue, or frame 2 broad sets of issues. One is, where do we stand in terms of democratization? And then secondly, the role of not just American, but more broadly, non-US actors in terms of democracy assistance and democracy promotion. So I think we have a full plate for the next 2 hours or so. And without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to Tom for his presentation.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. I want to congratulate the Center on its 10th anniversary, and I wish it many more years of success. It's really always a pleasure to come to Georgetown. I have many friends and many outstanding scholars here who I learn from and feel privileged to have as colleagues in the broader work on democracy that we all do. I'd like to offer just some general remarks to kind of frame the subject a little bit. As Sam said, I'm going to talk a bit about the state of democracy in the world and then about the field of international democracy support. There's a mood of democratic recession that many people feel with respect to democracy in the world. There's talk of democracy slipping back generally in the world in a number of different places. And there's a kind of a chastened or even dark quality to the commentary, particularly in the media, but also by experts on the field of democracy. I think I wouldn't go so far to say that we're really in a period of general recession. I think we're still in the period of sort of the gray period that arrived about 10 to 15 years ago after the initial wave of movement away from authoritarian regimes, in which we now have a world in which the majority of countries in the world, over 100 countries, were authoritarian 30 years ago and are not now. So they're sort of post-authoritarian, but the nature of their political systems is not very clear. I tend to think the fashion for the term hybrid regime, which is popular in political science, is a way that political scientists have of saying, I don't know what the heck it is, so call it hybrid. Because then it's something once you put a good word on it, especially when it sounds quasi-scientific, so it's almost a genetic experiment. You have it in your grasp. I think what's striking about the many countries that are post-authoritarian and about our thinking looking back on democratization over the last generation is that many of these societies, what they're really doing now, that they're in a post-authoritarian phase, is they're negotiating or renegotiating basic societal pacts among very different actors who differ on ethnicity, religion, regional status, or class status, or otherwise. And when you look around the world in many countries that are in a clear state of political uncertainty, you see that that's what's going on. Like Ukraine. Ukraine is having a societal negotiation over what it means to be Ukrainian, what it means to be the Ukrainian state. Turkey is having that discussion about the role of religion in Turkish life and the relationship between the military, secular establishment on the one side and others of a more religious bent. Syria is unfortunately bleeding to death over this very issue of whether or not there's a coherent idea of what it means to be a Syrian, and who does the Syrian state represent. But it's true further abroad. A couple of other countries I made a note here. Nigeria, conflict in Nigeria is an identity conflict in some ways, both regional, it's got ethnic characteristics, it's got religious characteristics. Nepal, still struggling to reach a compromise after having been unsettled in 1990 and unsettled again by the last revolution, trying to negotiate over the constitution and finally reach a societal pact. Bolivia went through this in the last 10 years with the indigenous movement finally coming to power, and again, renegotiating the idea of what Bolivia is. And so in some ways, one could make a larger historical argument that the phase of democratization of the last 20 to 25 years is the final phase of colonialism and the transition away from the formation of colonial states into the 21st century of states that will be settled, it is hoped, in terms of what they are, who they are, and so forth. And I think, I at least, but I think others among us 20 to 25 years ago didn't quite see the depth of these changes in the processes when we thought about what democratization was. It wasn't just the forms of the political system. It was the very nature of the states and the societies. The question is deep. It's really a deep historical process. That's the first thing I would say. The second is that, there's a mix of disappointments and a few positive trends. And since I try to keep a global perspective on this, let me just run through what I think some of the major disappointments are these days when one talks about a global trend towards democracy of the last generation. They're obvious, and we'll come back to them when we have talks by Steve and Sharon with more regional focus. The former Soviet Union is an enormous disappointment. It's not 20 years ago where many people, both within the region and outside, hoped it would be politically at all. And I don't need to chronicle its stabilities, but they're obvious, and I think Sharon will also take us deeper into that. But it's startling both in terms of what they've achieved, but also the role that Russia is playing as a regional, in some ways extra-regional actor in democratization. The Middle East also fits under the category of say, disappointments, although I don't have an entirely negative view. I do think the last 3 years we have moved quickly from some hope about emerging democratic transitions to a lot of concern over fragmentation and civil conflict. And it is true that the Arab Spring has gone quickly to a situation of both repression of that movement in a number of countries, but then also, as I say, civic conflict having emerged. But I do think there is nevertheless a real awareness that has grown in Arab societies of civic empowerment, and so forth. But nevertheless, the Middle East has to go into the category, I would say, of disappointment. In Central Europe, moving the lens a little bit more finely grained, I'd say there's a disappointment in parts of Southeastern Europe that, particularly in Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, being a member of the European Union turns out not to be as transformative politically as many people expected. I remember vividly a session in the 1990s I organized at Carnegie on Romania. And we had some Romanians there, and they were talking in a very unhappy and rather turgid fashion about the situation in Romania. And there was a German fellow listening. He was very impatient with them, and he stopped and he said, "You're going to end up in the European Union. This is all going to be worked out. Stop being so egoist. You're going to get there." And I remember being struck by that, and I wasn't sure. It was very appealing. Just get into the European Union, it'll fix it. These things will be ironed out. It's like combing a knotted sort of mass of hair. It's all going to be smoothed out. Well, it turns out not to be. And that's profound, both for what the European is, and also its implications for some of its membership. Another disappointment is China, in the sense that China has continued its remarkable economic growth for the most part, but actually has not lived up to the expectations of some that this kind of sustained economic growth could lead to political liberalization. It's a complex picture, and I don't need to oversimplify it too much, but China is not, so far at least, on any clear trajectory towards a more politically liberal state. And the automaticity that some people assumed that if you could have 30 years of 9% growth, it was almost certain to lead to a middle class that would have, these political aspirations and characteristics and so forth, hasn't proven true. It may still, but it's in the category of when we looked 20 years ago at the world, where we thought it was. And I also have listed here as disappointments, I have the United States, who I feel its democracy is both performing poorly, both for sort of structural and also for actor reasons. And I think it's real, and I think we have to include it in this list. Because a characteristic of the last 20 years is an effacement of the boundary between established democracies and establishing new democracies, to the point which I don't think it's a very useful distinction anymore. And it doesn't mean the United States is profoundly unstable, but I do think U.S. democracy is fundamentally troubled in some very serious ways. And I think Europe, a bit less so in certain ways as a whole, but nevertheless the concerns of the populism and right-wing nationalism, as well as the treatment of immigrants, and the basic health of a number of European political systems, particularly in Southern Europe, is notable. So these disappointments are big. They involve some of the most significant regions in the world. A couple of positive trends. I don't want to continue the regional tour too much, so I mentioned two thematic trends. One is that the multiplication or deconcentration of global power that people are writing about these days, coming to write articles about the West and the West and all that, actually has, I think, some good news in it, in that a lot of the middle powers that are emerging and asserting themselves in world democracies, we pay a lot of attention to Russia and China, and a couple of others that are not democracies, but there are a lot of others from Brazil to Indonesia to India, Turkey, and South Africa, and others that are. And the deconcentration of power in the world actually is a complex balance sheet. But democracy is actually doing pretty well in a broader sense in that way. The second thing that I think is a positive trend, I just wrote here, civil society turns out not to have been that. I myself wasn't sure. I wrote a book, or I edited a book in 2001 or 2 called Funding Virtue, about international efforts to support civil society, in which I was fairly critical of efforts that only reached a thin veneer of civil society in many countries that were specialized NGOs, not really rooted in their societies. And it was really unclear for a while whether the whole excitement over civil society and emergence of independent sectors was going to prove to be really a profound shift in the balance of power in the societies. But I think it has turned out to be in a number of cases. I'll come back to that. A third and final comment on the global state of democracy. It's tempting when you get asked to do a talk like this, it's fun to try to think, is there a single trend? I talked about the effacement of the line between established and newer democracies. Is there a single trend in the world that kind of captures this moment in history of where we are in terms of where domestic politics is going? If I were pressed to the wall and not recorded and put down on paper about this, I would describe it as, I think there is one. It's a bit incoherent still, I think, in the world, but I would